how do we as humans adapt and adjust to the fact that we're dealing with something immensely powerful, but also almost human in the way in which it can make mistakes.
Yeah, I think that there are going to be a lot of people in our society that are going to be out of work and needing some sort of universal income. I don't know if it's going to be in 5 to 6 years, but let's imagine dystopian Boaz was saying in 6 years there was going to be that kind of scenario.
This whole idea of, convicted, I mean, some people call it convicted lying, but this whole idea of like sort of responding to everything with high conviction, that's a design choice, right? It's a design choice to be able to answer it in that particular way, and then just as they all do, just have a little disclaimer, say this may or may not be right. There are alternatives to that.
And I personally have a very optimistic view of the future. I mean, I know that I'm in the business, so it's kind of it's in my nature to be optimistic, but I really do think we're going to see productivity gains like we've never seen before, not just in tech, but in all sorts of businesses, nonprofit, society, community service.
Hi there. Welcome to Humanity Working. Now, today's episode's a really interesting one. We've got Boaz Ashkenazy, who is the CEO and co-founder of Simply Augmented, and he's also the host of the Shift AI podcast, which is absolutely fascinating. If you've got any interest in the world of AI, strongly recommend you listen to it. And that, of course, is the topic that Boaz and I are going to be talking about today, AI. We're going to be looking at it from a couple of different angles, but mainly what AI is doing in the world of work today, and then what we think it will do over the course of the next few years to disrupt and change how we do work. But before we get to that, I've got a really, really simple request for you. Now, I know everybody's always asking you to like and subscribe, but it actually really is important. If you can, if you're watching us on YouTube or if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast, do take a moment to rate the podcast and let other people know why you like it. It really does make a difference. It will help other people find us, and it will help us also do a great job of recruiting really good guests for you. And on that topic, if you have any ideas as to additional guests you'd like us to feature, please email us at info@humanityworking.net. That is info@humanityworking.net, and we'll be sure to do our best to get them on as a guest. All right, enjoy the show. I kind of want to start with a little bit of a future view. Everybody has probably a good understanding of what, for example, generative AI, things like ChatGPT, etc., mean for them today. But I'd love us to fast forward, let's say 5 to 6 years. What are we, 2024 today? So let's imagine a world in 2030. What do you think the working experience is likely to be for humans in say 5 or 6 years in terms of how humans are interfacing with AI? What is the role they're playing? What is the role that AI is playing in that future world?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think that we're starting to see a little bit of it now, but not so much in the chat GPT sense where you're prompting a chat. But I think it's going to be a lot more invisible. I don't think we're going to have conferences on AI in 5 years. I don't think we're going to have podcasts about AI. I just think it's going to be everywhere. And I think it's going to be part of all the software that we use. And so I think from a human standpoint at work, you're going to be using software tools that you may use today. You might be logging into Salesforce. You might be logging into Microsoft tools or Notion or some other tools. And AI is going to be embedded in everything that you do. I think also that we're going to find that some of the monotonous things that we did previously, we're not going to have to do anymore. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have to work. It's just going to be doing different kinds of work. And I'll give you an example of that. A salesperson, for example, who spent a lot of time taking unstructured data and putting it into structured data is not going to have to do that anymore. What do I mean by unstructured data? Think about all the times previous to a lot of these note-taking tools that we now have, where you had to take down notes about a conversation, take those notes and put those into a form, put that form and put that into Salesforce. And there was this method of kind of getting all this unstructured information into a digital backbone that was a big part of your job. And a lot of the sales guys I talked to, that was the part of the job they hated the most. They wanted to be on phone calls with clients, not being, a data entry person. And I think that there's going to be a lot of those kinds of things that we just don't have to do anymore.
Yeah. It's intriguing because the this 6 year time horizon is one that I like to play around with quite a bit, because we know as human beings, right, we tend to underestimate in general. We tend to kind of like underestimate the amount of change that will happen in, say, let's say a 10-year time horizon or a 20-year
Yeah.
time horizon. But we tend to overestimate the amount of change that will happen to our lives in the next year or so, or something along those
Yeah.
lines. So this is sort of like comfortably sat in the middle. I guess to sort of like to probe a little bit deeper on that, it sounds like a interesting future, a future where work is potentially more rewarding. If I were to force you to be, I'd say, a little bit more dystopian, right? Because none
Yeah.
of this is certain, right? What would be I said, give me dystopian, Boaz. What would the dystopian 6 year time horizon be for you?
Yeah, I think that there are going to be a lot of people in our society that are going to be out of work and
Mm-hmm.
needing some sort of universal income. I don't know if it's going to be in 5 to 6 years, but let's imagine dystopian Boaz was saying in 6 years there was going to be that kind of scenario. I think we have to have
Yeah.
a hard question about what that looks like. And I know that in the United States we don't like to talk about that, but I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to talk about, and society is going to have to deal with it, because I think that there's going to be a certain stratus of jobs that are just not necessary anymore, and there's going to be some people that don't want to learn some of these new tools and are not going to be interested in kind of operating in some of these other areas. So I think that for stability in a dystopian world, there's going to have to be universal income. I really believe that eventually.
Yeah. Um, this is, I think, one of the more intriguing aspects as to the nature of this revolution, right? If we take the first piece of the answer that you gave, I loved it because you said that, we're not going to have conferences about AI. It's just going to be part of what we do, and history would suggest that, right? I mean, we're no
Yeah,
longer having like detailed conferences about, I don't know,
the
lower
internet.
levels of the networking stack, or
Yeah,
exactly, and things like that, right? It just becomes part of our
yeah,
everyday lives. But taken on face value, that can mean, oh well, it's just not important anymore. No, what it really means is that it's just become so central
yes,
to who we are, so central to our work environment, so central to our lives, that it's that and so ubiquitous that it's not the new disruptive thing. We've sort of taken on board the disruption,
yeah. But it's
which
impossible to
as
live
humans we're pretty
without.
good.
But impossible to
It's
live without.
impossible to,
Yeah,
yeah, impossible to live without. Exactly. But that the very fact that that is happening, and that is happening at the pace at which it is happening, um, can lead us, I think, potentially into situations where um, we're not paying enough attention to make sure that this is happening in a way that allows us to maintain society in the way that we hope. Do you think that there are lessons to learn from previous technology revolutions that will,
yeah.
and the way we've handled them either positively or negatively, that will allow us to be able to handle this one potentially better? I'm thinking of things like social media, for example, or other examples that you might want to think of.
I might go back even farther. I think there's two parts to it. There's the metaphor that's used a lot to describe AI, and that's electricity. The advent
Mm-hmm.
of the automobile. And one of the
Yeah.
things that's really interesting about that time, when you go back and look at the news coverage, is how much they talked about electrocution
Mm.
and the dangers around electricity. And now, I mean, we don't really think about. I mean, yes, you can still get electrocuted, but we figured out ways of kind of really mitigating the risks associated with electricity, and it's never going away. And the same thing is true with the automobile. There were real fears, and there were articles about the dangers of driving. And yes, people still get in accidents, but it's just really mitigated now. And I kind of feel like the monster AI robot that's going to take over humanity, that narrative is misplaced. I could be
Mm.
wrong, but I think it's misplaced. And I think in the future, there's still going to be that risk, of course, with AI and in certain kind of security and privacy issues. But I just think that as a society, we're going to figure out ways to deal with it. Not perfect, but figure out ways to deal with it in the same way we have with electrocution.
Can we dive into that metaphor a little deeper?
Sure.
I'm really struck by it because as you were describing that to me, I I was on the ride with you, and at the same time I was thinking I think there's something else here too though,
Mm,
because maybe maybe a lesson from the automobile is not that we shouldn't have been worried about that, but maybe that we didn't have the foresight to be worried about, in quotes, the right thing, right?
mm,
Because if you think about it today, right, automobiles are massive contributors to climate change.
yep.
And nobody in 1900, because because the concept didn't even exist, right? Nobody
Yeah.
in 1900 was thinking that through, right? So that it's possible that with regard to this, that we're worried about the crazy AI robot that's going to take us over, but we're not necessarily worrying about downstream effects that
Yeah.
that might impact us in a very severe way. That like the so as in similarly with the social media example, right? When social media launches,
Hmm.
people worried about a whole bunch of different things. I'm not sure that many of them were worried about things like teenage suicides.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, but I think you're right. And I'm not sure what those things are going to be, but we're already
Mm-hmm.
starting to see little things around the way that people, how comfortable people feel writing, how creative people are when they have these agents, assistants helping them along the way. And I
Huh.
find that fascinating too. I just wonder how that's going to evolve. How comfortable are people going to be with a blank piece of paper in front of them in 5 years, where they really feel like
Yeah.
they need something to help them get started, and maybe that's okay if we can figure out how to manage that. But I think there is going to be something lost. I'm not sure exactly what the all of the downstream effects are going to be, but I think it's a really interesting point.
And I suppose the answer to that is that we will figure that out if we're robust at studying early, not just the AI itself, but the human AI interface, if you like,
Yeah.
the changes in human behavior that are happening as AI becomes more part of our day to day lived experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, we as a company are so focused on the workplace. It's kind of an extension of the work that we did
Mm-hmm.
at Meta. Now we're just doing that for other companies. And so we're starting to see like what happens, not so much in a chat related interface, but just when you go to work and the job that you were doing now has AI as kind of supercharging that experience, what that does to you and how you go to work, how you show up for work. And that's really interesting. And I think we're going to see more of that. And in some ways, it's not going to be so dystopian. In some ways, it could be very positive. More
Mm-hmm.
and more people will have an opportunity to be more strategic and work on the business, not in the business. You hear this a lot with owners of a business getting dragged into the minutia of the business, and it's preventing them from growing. And I think the same thing is true for other people in the office. When you can take a step back and you have the time to think about how you can help grow the business, good things are going to happen. And I personally have a very optimistic view of the future. I mean, I know that I'm in the business, so it's kind of it's in my nature to be
Mm-hmm.
optimistic, but I really do think we're going to see productivity gains like we've never seen before, not just in tech, but in all sorts of businesses, nonprofit, society, community service. I think we're going to start to see some real productivity gains.
So that leads us rather neatly into kind of discussion of your organization and how it came about. So take us back to when you first started Simply Augmented. What was the idea and how has it evolved over time?
Yeah, I mean, I need to step back one more step because when I was at Meta, we were working in a company that had sent everybody home. And when I first started, everybody was at home, and then all of a sudden, people started trickling back. And but when what we were building were productivity tools for all sorts of folks in the organization, not just engineers. So we were building
Mm-hmm.
chat interfaces and other kinds of chatbots, but we were also building VR headset experiences and AR experiences for people in the data centers, facilities, security, all sorts of folks in that organization. It's a big organization. And when ChatGPT came out, one of the engineers on my team, a young engineer, very, very smart and savvy in machine learning and AI, approached me and said, we really need to start a company, and we need to do this. This is going to be big. And this was kind of early, right when ChatGPT came out, and I really, it was because of him that I got much more interested early on. And yeah, it made a lot of sense to take what we had learned about how to make employees more productive and just take that outside into the world. It just so happens that because of our size, we're a small agency, we tend to kind of our customer profile lives in this medium-sized business zone. We're trying to
Mhm.
help businesses with 100 to 300 employees try to figure out where Gen AI can fit into their workflows. So that's kind of our
Yeah.
obsession, is just understanding. A lot of people, they understand ChatGPT and they're learning about how to prompt engineer, but they're not really sure exactly what the power is of large language models in their existing workflows. And so that's what
Yeah.
we're really focused on.
Okay, so for our audience that they'll have I think a general understanding of what generative AI is, and they may have some understanding of what a large language model is, but probably most of their familiarity with it will be using something like ChatGPT or
Yeah.
Gemini or something along those lines. So,
Yeah.
I wonder if you just give us a little bit of a primer
Sure.
about large language models specifically, and what this means if you're not using, for example, out of the box GPT.
Yeah. I think out of the box GPT is a good reference point because I think people understand that. But there's a lot of
Mhm.
misconceptions about generative AI. And one of the misconceptions is it understands facts.
Mhm.
And it's trained on facts so that it can be a very good language processing tool. But it doesn't really understand facts in the way that we do, which is why you see a lot of businesses point those models at internal proprietary data.
Mhm.
If you give it data, and if you give it unstructured data, especially, and I'll explain that in a second, it does really, really, really well understanding what that is. So I'll give you a perfect example of some of the ways that we're doing this, and it'll give you a kind of a sense of the power of large language models. So we have a customer that is in the retirement account space, the self-directed retirement accounts, and they get a lot of inbound content from their customers, and it's all over the place, different formats. Some are PDFs, some are unstructured data that lives in documents and transcripts. So it's a very dispersed data. Inside their company, they have a very, very structured digital backbone, and there's an ERP system, and there's all sorts of structure. So when you think about, like, previous to generative AI, how would you get all that unstructured data into a structured system? You'd either make your employees do it. You would have them fill out forms and get it into a way that it would be able to be put into a structured table. Or you could have your customers do it. And you see this a lot on websites, right? You send them a form
Yeah.
and you make them do it. The customer experience is a bad one. I don't want to fill out another form. And the employee
Mhm.
experience slows you down. But now what we have is we have these tools we just didn't have before. We have tools that can read those documents, no matter how dispersed they are, make sense of it at a very, very high accuracy and put it into a structured database in an amazing way. It's uncanny. And the same
Mhm.
thing is true for another client that we have that's doing the same thing with unstructured data. This can be done within conversations like we're having that turn into transcripts. Now all of a sudden you have a bunch of data that can be brought into a structured form. And so I think that's where the real power is being able to make sense of all of this stuff in a way that we just couldn't before.
Yeah. It's funny when through our work, when we work with people on AI readiness, and we work with organizations around strategically adopting, particularly generative AI type models. Our focus is really on how to make the humans ready to bring AI into their team, as it were, and what this
Yeah.
means for organizational dynamics. So, for example, one of the analogies that we use is that you're almost taking old school managers that were supervisors, you're almost making every individual contributor in your
Yes.
organization a manager, because they're now coordinating a new team member, which is AI, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that every team now has at least one new member AI in it. And so this does a lot for like team dynamics and organizational dynamics, how the company should be
Yes.
structured, how it should be put together, and all this kind of stuff, all the human elements associated with it. But that is sort of tied, I would say, with a kind of general understanding from people about what these tools mean to them
Yeah.
today, as almost like a supercharger for their capabilities. As Zach
Yeah.
Ratner, who was recently on our podcast talking about this stuff, said, making you a little bit better at most of the things that you do, or making you a little bit
Yeah.
faster at most of the things that you do, right? But what I love about your approach as a supplement to that is what you're talking about is almost like going through, here are the things that the business does, right?
Yep.
Almost using almost like a lean manufacturing approach or something like that. Say, here's how everything that the business does breaks down into into these different processes, and then here's how we can use these tools as tools to optimize those processes more effectively. And I think
Exactly.
we need to, inside organizations, we need to do both. We need to think about what this means from a process optimization perspective, and what it means from a human organization perspective, if organizations really are going to realize the true potential of this type of technology. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've got another example that I think does both in a kind of interesting way, because I think that the superpowers for humans is important, especially if it's targeted on things that are very high value for the business. So let me give you an
Mm-hmm.
example. A commercial real estate company that we work with, a global one, they're called Savills, and they
Mm-hmm.
have brokers in their company. And the brokers are really the revenue generators in that company. And one of the things that they used to be stuck on was that they would try to go into very large data sets to try to get information that was critical for them to sell. And what that would look like is they would ask questions like, how many leases are there in the greater Detroit area that are coming up for lease for this particular sector of industry? And they would use that to prospect and go out, but they would have to go and talk to a data analyst to get that information. They wouldn't know how to
Mm-hmm.
write SQL queries, and they wouldn't know how to kind of suck that information and visualize it. But now with Gen AI, they can ask a question using natural language, just English. They can ask that
Yeah.
question. 50,000 leases, where are they right now in this greater area? And in the background, a function call is creating the SQL query, going out into the large database, authenticating into that database, coming back out. And actually, they're doing it in ChatGPT Enterprise, which is interesting. So we've built an extension on top of ChatGPT Enterprise. So the interface for them actually looks a lot like chat, except there's
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of steps that are happening in the background that they used to have to do manually that now they don't. That's affecting the top line of that business in a dramatic way. And I think that's how businesses need to think about it, is if they look at value, effort, and risk associated with Gen AI, that's the magic. Because there's some things that Gen AI doesn't do good. Even if it's a highly valuable thing, there's just regular machine learning or conventional software sometimes it's better. It's not good for everything. And I think there's also this misconception that Gen AI is this magic thing that solves everything. And it doesn't. It's really good at language processing right now.
When we started the conversation, you talked about misconceptions, and one of them was about like the idea of AI knowing facts and things like that. And that's something I want to talk to you about in a little bit more detail as well, because it's something that we've seen in our work, and I don't really know if we have an answer yet.
Yeah.
Um, what we've seen is that it's quite confusing for the humans in the mix to understand how AI, in quotes, makes mistakes.
Yeah.
And because I think the mental model that people hold in their heads is that this is just like regular technology. It's like Excel on steroids or something along those
Yeah.
lines, right? And it's just it's an upgrade to our existing version. But the thing is that if anybody's used any form of AI, whether it's generative AI like ChatGPT, or I don't know, or if they do full self driving in a Tesla, what they'll notice relatively quickly is it's not that it doesn't get things wrong, it's that it gets things wrong in ways that don't normally compute with the way that we expect those
Yeah.
things to go wrong. And so, for example, that can lead to things like over trust from a human, And we did an experiment in our organization whereby we asked a group of people to ask GPT some questions about something that they were expert in, that they personally were expert in, and they would obviously critique the responses
Yeah.
in some detail, and then take those very same people, having already got answers that they considered to be suboptimal from GPT, and have them ask it questions about a field that they were not expert in.
Mm-hmm.
And even though GPT had just got the answers from their perspective wrong in their own field, we asked them to rate the validity of the answer from GPT in a field that they were not expert, and they rated it incredibly high.
Interesting.
So because of this, we think because of this underlying expectation that it's sort of like Excel. In other words, if you ask Excel equals 3 plus 4, you expect Excel to come back with 7. How do you think, as humans that are interacting with this, and we're dealing with something that is inherently probabilistic in nature in terms of the answers that it's giving, how do we as humans adapt and adjust to the fact that we're dealing with something immensely powerful, but also almost human in the way in which it can make mistakes? Do you know what I mean? So it's
Absolutely.
like, how do we bridge that as we're trying to be truly productive and effective with it?
So interesting. I'm going to give an example of a project that we worked on that dealt with this. But I will say that, for a long time, we've been writing software in a really deterministic way. And when you do testing, where we used to do testing, you would just know this is a bug because it's not working the way that I thought it was going to. And now the bets are off, with a lot of this, because it's hard to be deterministic anymore. And it's hard to understand how to test some of this software. We had a project where, and this is live now, so people, your audience, if we put this in the notes, can go check this out.
Yeah,
this was a company in Kirkland, Washington, that was a tax advisor. It's called Formations. It's actually an interesting company because they're really tax advisors for businesses of one. That's their customer profile. People that have very, very small businesses and are trying to figure out, should I be a sole proprietor or an S corp? What should I do? How should I deal with my taxes? And they had some folks on staff that were amazing tax experts related to this particular field. And they wanted us to build a conversational AI experience that answered tax questions for people that were businesses of one. It was very, very important that it get the answers right. And what we found at first was when we broke up all the content that we were given from this company and just had large language models go directly to that content and give back answers, it was getting confused. But it was getting confused in a very, very convicted way, confident, and so it was hard to know. Like, it sounded good, and so but the experts in the business were looking at what was coming out on the other end, and they were saying, this is not right, this is not acceptable. And so what we had to do is we had to just tell the large language models to not use any of its general knowledge, and we had to point it at a curated database that this company curated, that we knew was clean, up to date, and correct. And we told the large language model, because we knew that it was processing language in a great way. We did certain things where we said, if you don't have the answer, you have to tell the user that you don't know, that you need to direct them to a human. And we just forced that.
Yeah.
And the accuracy dramatically increased when we did that. And so I think that there's this notion now, and this kind of feeds back into your question about workers. In 1996, there was this famous quote about content being king. And we had these content managers. That was a job, content manager. I think there's a new job out there, and that's knowledge manager. Because content, as you know, with the work that you do, is so easy to create now if you have a back-end knowledge base that's good and clean. You can create chat experiences, you can create blogs, you can create articles, all this stuff can get created from this golden database. And so I think that managing that knowledge inside a business, the brain of this business now becomes even more important. And there's going to be people, workers, that's their job, is to make sure that that knowledge is good and that is up to date. And then we learned a lot from that experience. And I think that a lot of people that are starting to use recall augmented generation and other kinds of techniques to go into proprietary databases are learning some of the same things.
You've made a very interesting choice on your website. And which I find really, really intriguing, and I'll mention, I'll just say I love. You go to the homepage of your website, right at the very start,
Mhm.
right there, is basically an AI chat experience right in
Yeah,
front, right front and center.
Robin.
Um, yeah, it's unusual, right? Even for organizations that are in this field, particularly if they're consulting in nature or something like that. That's not how that's not front and center. Um, what was the decision behind doing that, and what kind of feedback do you get on that?
Yeah. So we built that, and the name of the conversational AI agent is Robin. And but behind Robin is a database that we call a KGA database. It stands for known good answers. And we learned this through that experience
Mm,
that I talked to you about with the tax accountant. So we can go in and
yeah,
curate a known good answer database, and we have the confidence that Robin will answer questions about our business in a way that is accurate. We feel very confident about her ability. And if she doesn't know, she will say so, just like the example that I described before. And we thought it was important to surface that for customers, so that they could go in and ask us about pricing, ask us about how we work, ask us about our process, and get answers. And it's interesting to think about the ways that a prospecting tool like this can give people answers, but also ask questions, because Robin asks questions too. And that's the thing that's different about ChatGPT than Max, who is this the accounting tax accounting bot, and Robin,
yeah,
is that they will answer your questions all day long, but they'll also ask you questions too, because they're getting smarter the more that you talk to them, and they're trying to, in Max's case, qualify you. In Robin's case, she's not as hard of a qualifier as Max, but she's still asking questions and trying to understand about your business like a good salesperson would.
yeah. And I would encourage people to go to the website. I mean, hopefully they'll go to the website
Yeah,
and want to use your services. But even if they don't,
yeah,
I'd encourage people to go to the website and start interacting with it, because what I think it does, to your point, is it helps break through a couple of the myths that we're already forming about what these tools are like. Right? You made a very important point. I want to make sure people don't miss it. Right? This whole idea of, you know, convicted, I mean, some people call it convicted lying,
yeah,
but this whole idea of like sort of responding to everything with high conviction, that's a design choice,
yes,
right? It's a design choice to be able to answer it in that particular way, and then, just as they all do, just have a little disclaimer, say this may or may not be right. Right? There are alternatives to that. Right?
yeah,
It is possible as a design choice to be able to say I don't know. I've also seen implementations occasionally where, for example, it says um, I don't know, but this is my low confidence guess,
yeah,
or something along those
yeah,
lines. Right? These are all ways in which the responses can give an indication as to how much confidence
yeah,
the AI model has in the answer that it's giving you, which can be helpful or useful information.
yeah,
And then, of course, the other aspect of it is that there's we're starting to see models that are, to your point, not just answering questions, but asking questions. I've seen models, I'm sure you have too, that are like trained in the Socratic method
yeah,
effectively. And so they're the questioner and you're the one that's doing the thinking, and
right,
and they're drawing stuff that is out of you. And I think that will really help people understand that just what they see with Gemini, what they see with GPT is not the world, and it's
that's
just
right.
getting smarter and smarter versions of that. It's going to be much more nuanced than that, right?
Yeah, and I think that the other, you'll probably put this in your liner notes, but it's max.formationscorp.com. You can see kind of how Max
Yep.
is different than Robin. And that's the other thing I think that's interesting, is that we have a lot of control over the persona of these agents. And I know you know this because you play around with a lot of these, but they can have different
Yeah.
personalities. They can have different goals.
Oh yeah.
Max's goal is to qualify you, because the problem that the company had was the salespeople were getting bombarded by unqualified leads. So we were saying at the beginning, that's Max's goal, but it doesn't need to be. And I think people should understand that there's a lot of nuance to the way that you can design these agents in the background.
Boaz, let's talk briefly about co-pilots.
Sure.
Some people are becoming more familiar with co-pilots either through Salesforce or through the Microsoft co-pilots, the various releases that Microsoft's done with that. Um, Again, for anybody in our audience who hasn't experienced a co-pilot, if you could
Sure.
explain, what that is, how that works, but also where you see those going. Do you see them again, kind of fully blending into the background, even though there's a lot of marketing spend on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So co-pilots, you think about them as an assistant, an agent that lives next to whatever you happen to be doing as you're doing your normal work every day. So the classic example, and our engineers use this and get 40% increase in productivity, is GitHub Copilot. So GitHub Copilot lives
Mm-hmm.
next to your coding, and these software engineers are coding away, and it's recommending what it thinks should be the next line of code or the next lines of code. And you can accept that or you can change that, but it's kind of always happening. You see this a lot, with Microsoft Copilots. Write a better email, or do a better job, adjusting the article that you happen to be writing. If you think about like recommendation of writing, a little bit farther ahead of you, always giving you a little bit of coaching, that's a Copilot. And what we're starting to do is starting to build custom Copilots, because I think that some of the bigger companies are going to be building co-pilots for the software that we normally use as workers. Whether it's a Microsoft tool, or whether it's a Notion or a Salesforce, or other kinds of tools that we just use every day. But there's going to be some things that we want co-pilots for that are not so common. And we're starting to think about, how do you have that? How do you leverage a large language model that sits next to some form you're trying to fill out, or some website that you're trying to scrape and do research on something. There's a bunch of things that are a little bit. I just think you'll have co-pilots for all sorts of stuff.
So huge field, massively changing field, and so it's obviously something that your business is built around. But it's also something that very clearly is a personal passion of yours, and I know that that's leading to some of the discussions you have on the Shift AI podcast, which I talked about at
Yeah,
the outset here. Um, Tell, for those in the audience that are not familiar with the Shift AI podcast, talk a little bit about the origin of
sure.
that and the nature of the guest feature and what your goal is with it.
Yeah, the podcast was started actually when I was at Meta, and we were doing a lot of productivity tools, and we were thinking a lot about the future of work. And I wanted to be able to highlight people that were thinking about the future of work. And as AI took hold, more and more of those people were in the AI space. And when I left Meta, Geekwire, which is a local Pacific Northwest media publication, started to pick it up, and the guests that were part of the Pacific Northwest were showing up, in Geekwire, and so it kind of got more popular than it was when I first started. And what was exciting about the time that happened was that places like Seattle, places like San Francisco, we're starting to see a
Mhm.
lot more energy in the developer community, in the investor community, at the universities, with people thinking about this content. And so I started putting more people on the show I wanted to elevate, that were in the community. And so on the Shift AI podcast, we have founders, so young founders that are doing really interesting things with businesses. If anybody's used Read.ai, David Shim was on the show, or Udly, which is another tool that was incubated outside of the AI2 incubator in Seattle. We've had politicians on the show like Joe Wynn. Joe is a state senator in Washington, and he just put together the AI task force bill that just went through the Senate. So we're thinking about it from a policy
Mhm.
standpoint. Then we have investors from Madrona, from AI2, that are talking about what they're seeing, because they're getting pitched all day long, and they get a kind of vision into this world that most of us don't get. So I like to talk to them. And then luckily in Seattle, we happen to be in Amazon and Microsoft land, and we have the benefit of talking to these massive players that are, really, really
Yeah.
far ahead. And so we try to get a lot of folks. We had the head of Gen AI from Amazon AWS on the show. And you get these insights that are just fascinating. And the reason really I like what you're doing, Paul, is that I try to keep it personal. If anybody listens to the show, they know I ask questions about people's background. I ask them about their mentors and their family, because I want to kind of not just make it all about
Mhm.
AI hype. I want to understand, like, personally, where these folks are coming from and how this is impacting them. So it's a nuanced approach to technology.
I want to finish this off with a question that almost like brings us full circle from where we started. So when we started, if you remember, we were talking about where the world's going to be in 6 years' time, and of course, that's going to mean that as individuals, as humans, we're all doing different things at that point. So, what's Boaz's day going to look like in
My
2030?
day. Well, I happen to be the kind of person that enjoys talking to other people. It just so happens that for the last several years, it's been on calls like this. In the last year, it's been a lot more
Mm-hmm.
in person. I imagine that in 2030, I'm going to continue to be interfacing with people a lot. And I'm sure that a high percentage of that is going to be on my computer screen, but not all. I think that
Mm-hmm.
there is a lot of manual work that I do that interfaces between those conversations. I think a lot of that's going to go away. The way that this conversation is cataloged is going to just disappear, and it's going to show up for me in ways that are impactful for me. And I think there's going to be a lot of other things that are part of my everyday that are co-pilot like recommendations. Hey, you haven't talked to this guy in a while. You should probably reach out. Or, hey, you might want to think about, doing this. You haven't done this in a while. Just like tips and things that are that I have to remember that I'm no longer going to have to remember. And so I'm excited about the future, and I'm excited about being able to continue to engage with people. I think I'll have some friends helping me along the way, some AI friends helping me along the way.
Well, here's to an AI future where AI is enriching the human experience at work and outside of work. It's a great positive note to end on. Boaz,
Paul,
thanks
thank you
for
so
joining
much.
us
It
on the
was
pod
great
today.
talking with you today.
Thank you.